Welcome everybody. My name's Barb Champion and my colleagues Kieran and Karen and I will be co-hosting today's session. But before we begin, let's acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever we meet on today across the country and pay our respects to our elders past, present and emerging. But before we start, Kieran, some housekeeping issues, please.
Yeah, thanks, Barb. Welcome to our Microsoft Teams platform, everyone. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. What we've done is we've put you on forced mute, so you can't say anything during the course of the presentation. It's just to eliminate feedback. But what you can do is you can post questions in the chat, so please feel free to do so. And it's also important to mention that we're recording today's session. Back to you, Barb.
Okay, so let's get into it. And it is with huge pleasure that I welcome Sue Elliott to today's session. Sue and I have known each other for 25 years, it will be next year. And it's with huge delight that I can tell you a bit about her involvement in play. She has been a board member of Play Australia. She is now Dr. Sue Elliott, which is quite wonderful. And she's known to many of us as one of Australia's leading advocates for children and families and the environment. She's also a scientist, and this, of course, is why, one of the reasons why she's always taken such an interest in the whole issue of sustainability in both her teaching children, her teaching of young people as an academic in a university, and publishing on the importance of sustainability in early childhood. And tomorrow, when we send out the recording of today's session, we will include some links to some of these wonderful publications. She's a life member of Play Australia and has inspired many of us to think about what we do and how we do it. So, Sue, an enormous welcome to you. I can't tell you how excited I am that you are our opening presenter for our spring series. So over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara, for the welcome. I'm glad you've been counting the years that we've known each other. And thank you to Karen and Kieran as well and the Play Australia team. It's great to be here again with Play Australia. That's my family, that's my home and has been for many years. I'm a bit daunted by the number of people that registered for this session today. I believe it was over 500. Hopefully some people will be able to listen to this presentation at a later time, not necessarily today. And we also have a very broad audience of people today from early childhood, schools, local government, tertiary institutions. So I hope that I can cover sufficient breadth that there's something for everybody in this particular presentation. So I've entitled today's presentation, Is Sustainability Just About Being Outdoors? Possibilities for Early Years and School Outdoor Play Spaces. And before we proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge the earth. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the context within which we gather. We meet at a time when the human species is having an unprecedented impact on the planet. We do this at the beginning of this gathering as a reminder that the discussions we have here, the decisions we make, and any actions we take as a result will have consequences for other people and other species, both those living now as well as future generations. It's important that we acknowledge the earth that we live on and the limitations and how we are impacting the earth at this particular time. So I'd like to start with some myth busting. Yes, we all get immersed in nature, don't we? Outdoors. Some more than others, as you can see in this image. I'd encourage you to have a look at this Norwegian website. There are many images of older people clothed in various types of vegetation. Perhaps for those of you who are researchers, this might be the quintessential post-humanist researcher who is trying to break down those binaries between humans and nature. But we need to do more than being immersed in nature if we're going to create sustainable futures. That's my thinking. And I'd like to share with you some of the common misconceptions that I've come across over the years that I've been involved in outdoor play, sustainability, and nature play. And I think these misconceptions are certainly impacting the possibilities for sustainability in the early years and school outdoor play spaces. So firstly, we need to think about, well, is sustainability just about being outdoors? Some people have said that to me. We've been outdoors, therefore we've done sustainability. But sustainability is all-encompassing. It doesn't matter where you are, indoors, outdoors, on the moon. You've got to engage with sustainability in the way you think and the way you act.
Sue, sorry, Sue, sorry to interrupt you there. I'm just still seeing the first slide on the screen. Can I just get a hands up from everyone if you're just seeing the first one? Yeah. So we
okay, sorry. We've got a technical hitch there.
See how you go moving them along. And look, if the wheels fall off and it's not working for you, I can share my screen and I can share on your behalf. So just see how you go.
All right, my apologies about that. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I'm just using the arrow key to move forward, Kieran. So, all right. So the second point there is about sustainability is engaging in nature play. And this is certainly a good starting point, and we're in the middle of a global nature play movement at the moment. But how we engage in nature play, the pedagogies that we engage with children, and the deep philosophical and ethical thinking that can occur in nature play, is that happening? Another misconception is around sustainability is about installing a compost bin, and I would call this a tick the box approach. It's about providing tangible evidence that we're doing something about sustainability, but really what we need is a whole school or a whole service approach. Sustainability is about addressing green issues only, and this is far from the truth, because if you look at UNESCO's writing about sustainability, sustainability is multidimensional. Yes, there is an environmental or green dimension, but there are also political, social, cultural and economic dimensions of sustainability, and we need to embrace them all. Sustainability equals caring and protecting, and I'd like to call this soft sustainability, and this is the focus of sustainability that often comes into our work with children. Really what we need to be doing is talking about restoration and regeneration, advocacy and action. We have to go past simply caring and protecting. More is needed to be done at this time in the Earth's history. And I guess the last one, I've just moved on again, Kieran, is that working?
I think what I might do is I might share my screen, Sue.
Okay, thank you.
Then, yeah.
Right.
So
apologies,
just
everybody.
Bear with me. We love technical hiccups, don't we?
We love them. I'll end my show then.
Yeah. So you should see my screen now. Can you see that? I'm on your sustainability slide right there.
Yes, that's good.
That's great. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Are you going to be moving the slides on then, Kieran?
Yeah. Yep. So I've just moved across to indoor. Your comments about indoor learning.
Okay. All right. Let's stay on this slide for a moment. So another misconception, and the last one I'll mention, about does the real learning only occur indoors? Where would you rather be learning? Would you rather be indoors in this classroom, or would you be outdoors? And this image was taken at Thalgara Environmental Ed Centre near Armidale in a nature play space, which has now become integral to the programs that are held at Thalgara Environmental Ed Centre. And there's certainly growing research about the benefits of these sorts of outdoor learning environments for children, whether it's executive functioning skills, social skills, risk management, mental health, even behaviour management. There was a school in Queensland during COVID that decided to move some of their learning outside, and the impact on children's behaviour was astounding and a light bulb moment for all the staff in that particular school. So what we need is a more balanced approach to understand that there is indoor and outdoor learning. Both of those have value, and there are certainly better outcomes for children and for sustainability if we have more outdoor learning happening. You could move on. Thanks, Kieran.
So you should be viewing current COVID contexts.
Not yet.
No. Oh,
Oh
Sue.
dear.
No, you're not seeing that.
No. Must be all the thunderstorms that are happening around Australia at the moment.
We'll give it a moment to see whether it'll
Kieran,
catch up.
it's working for the rest of us. Current COVID context is on the screen now.
Oh, you can. So Sue, everyone can see current COVID contexts.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
You just say next and I'll shuffle it along.
Okay. Well, current COVID context. I do have a hard copy in front of me, so
Terrific.
I'll
Well
work from
prepared.
that. I guess, in addition to these misconceptions, it would be remiss if I didn't say something about the current COVID context, in that we now know that outdoors is generally a safer place to be, particularly if there are a high density of people. We know that outdoor play opportunities for children were significantly closed down. And also we know that education departments are, in some of their literature anyway, suggesting that outdoors is a place for learning to occur in schools, and most definitely in early childhood services, where it's certainly more common to be outdoors with children. And it's also been interesting that there's a paper by Deb Moore where she looked at with her colleagues, looked at what was happening during COVID for children and some of the play opportunities that were emerging in local communities, and found that children were building cubbies in all sorts of interesting places in their local community, even while they were restricted at home. And if you have a look at the next slide, this is one example of a cubby on a nature strip that I found during COVID. And this was evolved and built over a significant period of time by children on this particular nature strip. I also noticed a nature strip where the grass was being cut in a maze-like pattern, so that it encouraged children's playful engagement with that particular nature strip area. So if we move on to the next slide, which is an overview, having clarified some of those misconceptions, I'd now like to move ahead and think about how we might structure today, and I'm going to use Simon Sinek's framework of golden circles as a way to convey some ideas about how you might inspire and lead change in relation to outdoor play spaces. So Sinek's golden circles will be a framework, and essentially his framework is about why engage with sustainability, then how to shift thinking, and what we can do outdoors. I'm not sure if anyone's come across Simon Sinek's work before, but I would encourage you to Google him. There's lots of YouTube videos that you can see about his work. So on the next page, number 1, on the next slide, Simon Sinek's golden circles, he argues that we begin with why to inspire change. And this circular diagram suggests that what we need to do is start in the middle with why, move to how, and then what. If you're going to lead change, this is the order in which you need to do things in your particular community. Unfortunately, what happens when people start thinking about sustainability and outdoor play spaces, they often begin with the what. What? We need a compost bin. What? We need a water tank. But if you start with the what, you're not going to inspire and lead change and bring people along with you as an educational community. So beginning with why is what we're going to do today. If you move on to the next slide, why engage with sustainability? Can I just check that everybody else is on the number 2, why engage with sustainability? Good, thank you. Why engage with sustainability? This is the first conversation that you need to have. Climate change will not go away. The 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report has made it very clear about the human impacts on the Earth at the moment. COP26 you might have heard of, that was held in Glasgow last year, the Climate Change Summit. There are many outcomes of that particular conference of parties that was held in Glasgow. And one of the particular interesting aspects of that Conference of Parties was that for the first time in that meeting, Ministers of the Environment and Ministers of Education came together to discuss how they might promote and further education for sustainability, generally in education. So there's hope there that those conversations that are happening at a very high international level are going to result in pledges by individual countries about how we can better get education and environment working together. And we know in Australia that's quite challenging to get those different government departments to work together for what we see as a very much a shared thing of trying to progress sustainability and education at the same time. And the last point there is really about the changes in global temperatures and highlighting the urgency that we do need to take some action. That's some of the discussion that can happen about why engage with sustainability. And on the next slide, I've just put an image, a recent image of the floods in Australia. I hope that everybody who's listening today and in the future is safe. But if these international reports are not convincing enough, the current weather emergencies that we've got really tell us that we are in the grip of climate change at the moment. So if we move on to the next slide, another reason that you could be discussing with colleagues in your community, another reason why we need to engage in sustainability is the current concerns about children's health and well-being. And I've listed some of them that have come from the literature there. Obesity, myopia, vitamin D deficiencies, eco-anxiety, concerns about physical skills, children's mental health, and their nutrition. All of these things are some of the 21st century concerns that we have around children's health. And these concerns are being compounded by the impacts of climate change, which is going to bring higher rates of disease for children, food shortages, and family dislocation due to extreme weather events. So all of these things are going to certainly have a big impact and are having an impact on children's health and well-being. Another reason why we need to be doing something about sustainability and our outdoor spaces. And I have to wonder, if you look at that image there, that photograph was taken at the Patch Primary School some years ago now. This is a leading school in Victoria and was and still is. And you can't help wondering if children were able to play outdoors and learn outdoors in a space like that, that we wouldn't be dealing with some of the issues that we've got now. That's a space that every child needs to be in, outdoors. And if we move on to the next slide, a final reason of why we need to be engaging in these conversations with others is around the links to children's rights. And UNICEF has made it quite clear that the climate crisis is a child's right crisis. So what's happening is that children's rights are being eroded by the sorts of climate change things that I've talked about. And what this is doing is contributing to inequities, both on a global level and local level, and also an intergenerational level. And Australia is certainly not immune to these challenges. And you can see in the map that's come from the UNICEF website that Australia is certainly on the map. The colouring on the map suggests Australia is certainly involved with heat waves, cyclones, flooding, water scarcity and diseases. So this is not just something that is happening in less developed countries. This is something that's relevant to Australia too, that rights are being eroded. So if we move to the next slide, my favourite quote at the moment is from Clark et al., which is actually from the Lancet. And I think you could probably say if the Lancet's getting on board with this, then it's time to sit up and take notice. That we live in an era like no other. Our children face a future of great opportunity, but they stand on the precipice of a climate crisis. So I have to ask, how are we educating today with children at this precipice? What outdoor spaces could we offer children that may address some of these concerns? If we move to the next slide. So outdoor play spaces may offer many possibilities for change. If we begin with this discussion about why, understanding what is sustainability, What is climate change? What are the rights issues? What are the health and wellbeing issues? And if you begin with why and those sorts of conversations, then what you're going to be doing is sharing a set of beliefs, values and ethics to understand where everybody in your education community is coming from. They may have different ideas about outdoor play and learning and think it's a waste of time. So you've got to have those conversations to start with. Through that process, you can also inspire some critical reflection and decision making and take some action. You can be promoting social learning and engage in shared problem solving around sustainability issues if you're having those discussions about why. And you can also practice distributed leadership. So it's not just one person that's going to inspire change in outdoor play spaces, but there might be many people involved, whether it's educators, principals, management, families, children, external stakeholders. There are many possibilities for distributed leadership. So what we're trying to do here, above everything else, is to promote embedding sustainability as the norm, or just what we do outdoors and beyond. And beyond, I mean indoors and everywhere else that you happen to be. That's what we need to do. So if we move from why now to the how in terms of Sinek's golden circles, on the next slide, how to shift thinking. And I want to highlight some leverage points that I think are important for educators in moving forward with outdoor play spaces to embrace sustainability much more. Some of these you might already be familiar with, but I'm hoping that some of them might be new for some people. So let's look at some international leverage points to start with. So there are international networks of sustainable schools where outdoor learning is absolutely integral to what they do in their schools. So the green schools and the eco schools, some of you might be familiar with those, but they're leading organisations promoting sustainability in outdoor contexts. Also, the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals are really important at the moment. Published in 2017, this is an international framework for sustainability, and there are many aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals that can be linked to outdoor play spaces and sustainability. The two things that I want to highlight for you here is that the document from UNESCO does offer 8 key competencies, and they're competencies that I think would be worth looking at in terms of how they relate to outdoor spaces. So, for example, one of the competencies is around systems thinking, about understanding the connections between plants and animals and people and the physical environment. So that systems thinking, understanding systems and engaging in systems thinking is something we can be doing outdoors with children in appropriate sorts of outdoor play spaces that have those systems inherent in them. So that's experiential learning in those outdoor spaces about systems. And also, if you have a look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, most often when I work with educators, we tend to head towards number 4, which is about quality education. But actually, those Sustainable Development Goals, there are many of them that can be mapped to the sorts of things that we do in schools and early childhood services. And there was an issue of the International Journal of Early Childhood Environmental Education that was published last year. And all of the papers in this special issue were about linking these Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, to the sorts of practices that were occurring in early childhood services. And perhaps just to give you one example to highlight that, if you were deciding that perhaps you'd like to grow a productive vegetable garden and share that produce with your community, which quite often schools and early childhood services do, that might link to the Sustainable Development Goal number 10 around reduced inequalities. It might link to number 3 around health and well-being, or it might link to number 2 about hunger and food. And along with that, we'll go those discussions about food miles, about seasonality, about the organic produce. There are so many topics that could be explored within something like a productive garden bed that links to those sustainable development goals. So that's a key document to refer to at this time. So if we move on to how to shift thinking at some of the national leverage points, and here I want to focus particularly on the curriculum documents that we all use on a daily basis. Many of us do anyway. And these national curriculum documents are part of how you can work with other people to say, look, it's in the curriculum document. This is what we need to be doing in our school or in our early childhood service. So if we start with the early years learning framework for early childhood services, there's a very strong statement in that document that I've quoted there on the slide. I won't read it to you, but it really encapsulates the sort of play spaces that we need, with natural elements that invite open-ended interaction, spontaneity, risk-taking, connection with nature. It's all there. That's the benchmark from where you can start in an early childhood service. Also, some of you may be aware that the early years learning framework is currently under review, and it's been proposed that there will be a new sustainability principle within the new early years learning framework, which will come out next year. So that's a very important shift in line with what's happening internationally with early childhood curricula. And we also have the National Quality Standard, which includes environmental responsibility. So environmental responsibility myself, I find that sort of fits into the soft sustainability area. If I go back to my words of restoration, regeneration, advocacy and action, that's where we need to be. Environmental responsibility to me is putting your rubbish in the bin and doesn't go much further. Okay, if we turn now to the Australian curriculum on the next slide, many of you would be familiar with the Australian curriculum that's comprised around general learning capabilities, key learning areas, and cross-curriculum priorities. And all of those general learning capabilities, the critical and creative thinking, ethical understandings, all of these can be linked to outdoor learning and learning about sustainability. And perhaps one example would be ethical understanding. How do we ethically engage in relationships with the earth, with all the species that we share this planet with? And how do we ensure that future generations have the same opportunities that we do? That's a big ethical question for adults, but it's something that we could be discussing with children in the context of general learning capabilities. The key learning areas also can be related to sustainability in many different ways. Just to be topical, I notice that there's quite a bit in the media about primary teachers and lesson plans at the moment, and teachers not having time to actually develop their own teaching materials. One would hope that those lesson plans in some way make some links to the key learning areas and sustainability learning outdoors. That's what I would be hoping for. Perhaps they don't, I don't know. And then the cross-curriculum priorities is another area, whether it's sustainability and also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. If I focus just briefly on the next slide on sustainability as a cross-curriculum priority, I'm not sure how many people have gone into looking at the concepts that are actually underpin that particular priority. But there are three concepts there: exploring the interdependent and dynamic nature of systems, enabling a diversity of worldviews on ecosystems, and building capacities for thinking and acting. How could you possibly do those if you were only teaching and learning indoors? To me, those concepts, they need to be outdoors, they need to be experiential, inquiry-based, and if you have an outdoor play space that has natural elements, has spaces where children can be actively learning outside, then there's potential for all of those concepts to be explored for you to embrace that cross-curriculum priority. Okay, let's move on. Thanks, Kieran. how to shift thinking. If we keep going with shifting this thinking, what are some of the local leverage points that are possible if we're going to change our outdoor spaces? Maybe you were doing some of these things already. So things like seeking community partnerships for expertise, whether it's land care groups, wildlife carers, plant nurseries, there are many possibilities. Finding local community issues for children's research and action. And I've come across many early childhood services that have identified local issues, whether it's endangered species, or it might be a revegetation project, or it might be collecting waste in local waterways. Whatever the issue is, there's a possibility for children's engagement. And some of these things can be translated into the outdoor spaces as well. And there's also a need to collaborate with families to encourage skill sharing and engagement in their children's learning about sustainability. And parents, in my experience anyway, particularly with early childhood services, we can readily engage parents in the redevelopment of outdoor play spaces, whether it's a garden bed or planting a tree or doing some watering. There are lots of possibilities. And I would also encourage you to search local education department and education for sustainability websites, various organisations. I've just listed a few there. But when you search some of these sites, government departments have lots of resources to support teachers in engaging in sustainability. And there's lots of training that's available as well from different organisations. So this is the how. These are the leverage points that we can use in taking that journey towards some outdoor play spaces that are appropriate for engaging with sustainability. We now move on to the what. And I know some of you might have been itching to start with the what. You know, what can we do outdoors? But I hope that by going on this journey of the why and the how to the what, you're getting a better understanding of what needs to happen as a process with an education community to actually deepen the understanding so that you get to this point of actually doing something in your outdoors. What are we going to do outdoors? So I've chosen today 3 foci. It's not possible to cover absolutely everything, but 3 foci: design and infrastructure. And I know there are some landscape designers here and landscape architects that are more qualified than myself to speak on this topic, but I'll do my best. Certainly biodiversity and sustainable living. So let's have a look at some of these areas. And I'll just highlight the photograph on that slide around what can we do is actually a nature playscape at the University of Cincinnati Children's Centre. And that Children's Centre has a commitment to sustainability, and this is part of their outdoor play space. It's an amazing space to visit, and there is so much learning going on in that space. So the next slide, if we look at some design and infrastructure ideas. Thanks, Kieran. So the first thing to consider there, the first point on the left, is around the siting of buildings to maximise outdoor space and amenable weather aspects. We want comfortable spaces outdoors for teachers and for children. Nobody wants to teach in a wind tunnel or in brilliant sunshine. So can we please create some comfortable spaces outside that are actually going to encourage teachers and children to spend sustained periods of time outside learning and engaging with their outdoor environment. And this aspect, it's particularly under pressure at the moment because you've probably seen the media around high-rise schools beginning. And we already have children's centres that are on the top of high-rise buildings where space is limited and natural elements can be limited. So there's a real concern here, and we need lots of advocacy around the importance of having outdoor spaces that do meet regulations in terms of the space required, but also have a range of natural elements and access to sunlight. To actually be able to see the sun and the sky above your head is pretty important. And creating a diversity of outdoor areas for teaching and learning, and including those links between indoor and outdoor. Early childhood services do this pretty well, but schools, I'm afraid, don't. And I've provided some photographs there, are actually from Spenceley Street School in Melbourne in North Fitzroy. And this is a school that my daughter attended, and some of these photographs are actually from at least 10 years ago. That school was leading and still is leading in terms of how they see the outdoors for learning with children. And you can see the indoor-outdoor learning decks and the small deck area surrounded by vegetation, which creates a natural outdoor learning space for teachers and for children. The last point on that slide there I'd mention is around solar panels, that there are significant programs available, the solar school programs, where solar panels can be installed. So that has economic impacts for the school, but it's also a learning opportunity with children about monitoring the solar panels and what's happening with them and how do they work, and links to key learning areas like science and geography and maths. If we move on to the next slide, thanks, Kieran. Another few aspects around design and infrastructure, minimising the heat issues. And excuse the pun, but this is a really hot topic because the Cool Schools report that came out from researchers at the University of Western Sydney is quite compelling reading, and I think it should be read by every education department across Australia, because they are talking about thermal comfort, about those spaces outdoors because of the infrastructure that's in place in many outdoor spaces, such as the synthetic surfacing. This is creating heat, which is impacting the comfort of those outdoor spaces. So we need to be very careful about the materials that we choose outdoors so that we're not creating those hot areas that are just going to be inhospitable for children and for staff. And probably the most compelling figure out of that report is when the temperature was 30 degrees centigrade ambient, the synthetic softball was a temperature between 80 and 90 degrees centigrade. Nobody wants to be in a space like that for outdoor learning, and it's certainly a significant concern for children, for the health of children and for staff in those settings. So I'll get off my high horse on that one, but that's I see as a really big issue. The maximising water efficiencies, there are lots of things that can be done there, from hydro panels to water tanks, permeable surfaces, water recycling, and where feasible, and low flow taps. The image you can see there are the hydro panels on the top of Armidale Community Preschool, just locally, and they are able to produce between 60 and 120 litres of drinking water per day for the children in that centre. And that was installed during the 2019-2020 drought in Armidale. So that was important for that preschool, and the children were very involved in that process of understanding what the hydro panels were about and how they were producing water for the children to drink in that centre. It's also important to look at shade with trees, usable verandas. When I say usable, they need to be wide enough so that there can be learning experiences placed outside on those verandas. And they need to be wide enough to give the shade that's needed, not tiny verandas that are totally unserviceable. And things like pergolas and cubby spaces also provide shade. The Cancer Council, which I worked at in a previous life, the Cancer Council does provide quite a lot of guidance around shade. And you don't have to go straight to a shade structure. There are many ways of creating natural shade, which again are going to lower the temperatures that you have in your outdoor space. The next slide, thanks, Kieran. So also thinking about installing outdoor child accessible storage for loose parts such as pipes or containers, equipment like gardening tools, or perhaps there's sports equipment or ball games. I know that some schools are using shipping containers so that they've got ready access to these materials, but there may be other ways that you can investigate to provide accessible storage for children. In early childhood services, often having a cupboard that is only 1 crate deep is a way, and the doors totally open, is a way to create storage for children that acknowledges children's agency and rights around selecting the equipment they need on a particular day. Using repurposed and recycled materials is important too, whether it's packing crates, pallets, tyres, curtains, logs. And there's an example there again from Thalgara Environmental Ed Centre where a pallet was used, it was painted, and then there are loose materials that are available for the children to build with. And these are primary school age children enjoying playing in their space and learning in their space. And also ensuring that garden areas are integral to the overall design of the outdoors so that you do have those natural elements that also have that cooling effect on the whole outdoor space. And there's an excellent example, Wales Street Primary School in Melbourne. I seem to keep going back to Melbourne. Some of you know that's where I'm originally from, but that's where there are some excellent examples. There are possibly examples elsewhere, but I do keep going back to Melbourne. Wales Street has a nature play garden in their primary school that's been developed. They do encourage outdoor learning, and they're currently doing a redevelopment, and I've put the website there for their redevelopment plans. And in that redevelopment, the outdoors and the indoors are very much integrated. It's not like we have a building and that's where the classrooms are and we have a strip of asphalt and that's where we play outdoors. So there's very much an integrated approach there to the design and infrastructure. So on the next slide, just for a bit of light relief, these are some shady cubby spaces that I rather like in terms of design and infrastructure. There's a willow cubby there, so if you can find somebody that likes to use willow, which is actually a weed, but there's a productive way of using it to make a cubby space. Beanpole cubbies have been around for a long time, and that's a possibility, nice and shady and edible. And the bottom picture is actually from the children's garden in Melbourne, the Botanic Gardens, and I've actually taught in that space. And if you want something, a more formal structure in an outdoor space, I found that quite workable as an outdoor space for learning, which provides shade and ready access for children and teachers. So I'll move on to the second focus area now, and that's around biodiversity. So we'll leave design and infrastructure and move on to biodiversity. So lots of things that you can be doing around biodiversity to improve the potential for sustainability outdoors. And I think most of these are fairly common sense and you would have come across them in some way, whether it's native plants and indigenous plants local to your area, the installing bird possum or bat boxes perhaps, a frog pond, an insect hotel, a butterfly garden, green planted walls and bush tucker gardens. All of these could be projects that are developed with children, with families, and they can be part of the outdoor play space to enhance the biodiversity of outdoors. In particular there, I'd highlight the photograph at the bottom, which is a frog pond, and that was integral to a research project at KU Arimba Children's Centre on the Central Coast in New South Wales. And there we were actually in that project looking at biodiversity with children and particularly protecting some of the endangered native frogs in that area. That project had many, many spin-offs in terms of looking at waste in waterways beyond the frog pond that they actually had in their early childhood centre. So lots of learning happening through that project. And some images on the next slide. Thanks, Kieran. I'll just explain these images briefly. On the left, you can see a pond. Again, I go back to the Patch Primary School. And I can hear some of you saying, oh, that's too risky, that's too challenging, I can't do that in my school. But this is a public school in Melbourne and they have a pond, all right? I've also seen an early childhood service in Japan that had an ecological pond. It wasn't a water play area, not for children, but an ecological pond where thriving ecosystems and biodiversity could actually be explored with children as part of their science or their geography learning. It could be maths learning around water quality. There's lots of possibilities there. If you have a very small space, then a wall type garden might help and also soften the environment. These pansy pots are down at Corindi Preschool. And of course you could be planting herbs or anything you like there. And bird hollows is another way. Perhaps securing some bird hollows in a tree might be another option for encouraging some biodiversity in your outdoor areas. On the next slide, I'd just like to highlight a particular project called Bringing Back the Butterflies. Thanks, Kieran. This is a community initiative that was established by the South Australian chapter of the Australian Association for Environmental Education to recreate native habitat for butterflies and other pollinators. So this has been a very positive experience in South Australia, particularly in Adelaide, and there are many schools and early childhood services that have been actively involved in this program, where the children have been researching the butterfly food plants, setting up butterfly gardens, establishing them, watering, maintaining them, and then researching the butterflies and butterfly life cycles. So again, learning across science, but also doing the research, and very much a child-led project. And I'm at the moment reviewing a case study from an early childhood service that was very much involved in this particular program. And it had much learning for children in that project. The last area that I'd like to focus on, thanks Kieran, is around sustainable living outdoors and what we can be doing in a more general sense around sustainable living outdoors. Obviously, the composting and the worm farms comes to the fore. That's part of sustainable living with our organic waste from our lunches. We can be recycling lunch waste again. Perhaps we can have repair facilities, whether we're repairing using woodwork or whether we're repairing bikes. That sort of idea of repair and then reuse again is something that needs to be advocated as part of sustainable living. Employing sustainable purchasing criteria for outdoor equipment. I'm aware of some services where they've purchased recycled plastic outdoor equipment as opposed to purchasing equipment that's made of other less sustainable materials. So that's a possibility outdoors. And certainly planting vegetable gardens. That seems to be happening quite a lot in early childhood services and in schools, particularly through the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden Foundation. And can you please plant some fruit trees? This is one of my bugs, because a child once told me that the apples come from the supermarket. And when I asked, where does the supermarket get the apples from? She said, well, they get all this yellow stuff and they squash it together and they put more stuff on the outside and then you've got an apple. My goodness me, can we please have fruit trees in our early childhood services and our schools? And yes, I know there are potentially issues with birds, but children need to know where their produce comes from and discuss seasonality and food miles and ethical purchasing of food, rather than thinking that everything comes from the supermarket and you can buy it whatever time of year you like. These are the sorts of discussions that can be happening around fruit trees and around gardening that focuses on sustainability. And the two images I've got there, it doesn't matter what size of space you've got. The small one on the left there is some and what I would refer to as an innovative risk management strategy, where in this particular early childhood centre, they've put a small herb garden around the bottom of a shade structure pole. So it's clearly so that children won't bump into the pole, but it's also making the most of a small space where there could be a herb garden. And on the right there, a much, much bigger Stephanie Alexander Garden Foundation kitchen garden, which has been developed at Kentucky School, which is near where I live. So another story, if we move to the next slide, Kieran. This is the Building Sustainable Cubbies, the Cool Cubbies project. And this was a research project that was written up by Wendy Boyd initially in 2015, but these particular Cool Cubbies are still going strong. and they really showcase what sustainable living can be about. Because what happened in this project was that a Rouse Water Board got together with Early Childhood Services to introduce the idea of cool cubbies. And so each cubby was provided to 8 different early childhood services up in the northern New South Wales area. And those cubbies were sustainable cubbies. They were designed with a solar panel, a water tank, both a native and a vegetable garden, a weather vane and a worm farm. And those cubbies are still being used today for children engaged in dramatic play and also learning about the sustainable features of those cubbies. I do wonder if perhaps a group of school-aged children could build their own sustainable cubby. Maybe there are projects like that out in the school sector. Thank you, Kieran. So it's getting close to time and I need to wind things up. The last couple of slides I want to share is around saying, well, it's not enough just to focus on the tangible what. You know, the biodiversity, the infrastructure and design, and the sustainable living. What we need to do outdoors is to be able to weave those things together with pedagogy. I've already highlighted how the curriculum can support these sorts of changes in our outdoor spaces, but the pedagogy, what educators do and how they interact with children, is going to really determine whether sustainability comes to the fore or not. And it's a bit complex, a bit like that tree trunk that I've shown in the image there. And what I'd like to share with you is some pedagogical principles that I've been working on with my colleague Julie Davis for a new publication by Early Childhood Australia. And what we've got there are 6 pedagogical principles. Those of you who are early childhood educators would understand that there are principles within the early years learning framework, and there are also practices. And what we're trying to do here is to take those principles and practices a bit further and to give us some pedagogical principles for sustainability. And these are briefly around collective action for change, transformative pedagogies, ethically informed relationships, democratic and civic participation with children, awareness of worldviews, and promotion of children as agentic with rights. Now, I know that's a lot to throw at you at the end of a lecture, but I encourage you to think more deeply, not just about the how, why, and what that you will do with your education community, but then think about, well, what are the pedagogical principles that I'm going to embed that are going to wrap this all together to make it into the next slide, ultimately, a whole setting approach. And a whole setting approach is something that's been around in the literature for quite some time. Professor Arjen Walls in the Netherlands is doing some work on this at the moment and has come up with some of these ideas, this sort of flower design of how we might take a whole setting approach and embed sustainability across everything. And what I've tried to do today is to sort of touch on some of those areas, such as on the bottom right, there's the building management and operations. So where do we actually learn? That's where the outdoors play space fits. I've talked about curriculum up on the top right of that flower design, and I've talked just briefly at the end about pedagogy and how that might wrap things together. So there are many aspects to a whole school approach, and the outdoors and sustainability is just one of those parts. I'd also highlight for you that the circle around that flower design is actually a circle of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're the colours of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals around the outside that act as a framework for a whole setting approach. So thank you, Kieran. So what is your action plan? That's my last question for you. Cynic's why, how and what may be the way to transform your outdoor play space for sustainable futures. I've used the image of the cicada there quite purposefully. I hope you can find lots of cicadas in your outdoor play space. Once upon a time, we used to collect those when I was a child at school. But please don't take as long as a cicada life cycle to change your outdoor play space. Sometimes cicadas take up to 17 years to transform into adult cicadas. We haven't got 17 years to wait for children to have sustainable outdoor play spaces. Thanks, everybody. Hope you found something of interest there. If we could just scroll on to the references and the acknowledgements. Thanks, Kieran.
Beautiful, Sue.
Okay, thanks, Kieran. I'll hand back to you. And Barbara.
Thanks, Sue. We've got time for a question or two. Kieran, do we have any?
I'll just check the chat now. Many thanks. No, I think we've just got a lot of fans out there, Sue.
Sue, you never ever cease to amaze me. Every time I think I know what you're going to produce, you don't. You produce, well, you do. You produce it and 1,000 times more. I think we ought to make your presentation compulsory listening and hearing. I can see Karen nodding, and Karen will send this out. You're happy, Sue, for it to go out?
Yes. Thank you. And I hope everybody has success in transforming their outdoor play spaces and engaging with sustainability more.
Thank you. Well, it was absolutely wonderful.
Hey, Barb, can I just butt in quickly? There is one quick question, Sue. The name of the publication that you've got coming out, is there a title yet that people can look out for?
Oh, actually.
Or is it too premature?
A bit premature. It's at the second proofing stage. And there's still some discussion around the title, but it's an Early Childhood Australia publication.
Yeah.
And just briefly, the history of it is that in 2003, Julie Davis and I did a small booklet for Early Childhood Australia called Making It Mainstream. And it's almost 20 years later, we were invited to do an update and review. Well, the update and review turned out to be something that was 3 or 4 times longer than the original booklet. So much has happened in the last 20 years. So do look out for it with Early Childhood Australia. In the meantime, there is the Box of Earth Provocations for Our Earth, which is available from ECA, which a number of academics and educators worked on. I think that was probably 12 months ago now. And that was a bestseller at the recent ECA conference, I've been told. So I'm pretty excited about that.
And Sue, you'll be pleased to know that your first very significant book, The Outdoor Play Space Naturally, still is received with great interest. We run a training program for early years services around maintenance, and I always give people details about this book, so I'm sure that is still leaping off the shelves as well. It's really so inspirational what you have provided for us today, and we will make sure that we use it and circulate it widely and often. So thank you enormously. It was just wonderful. Before everybody goes, can I remind you that our session next week, which is for members only, most of these sessions are for members, and so I would encourage people with us today who wish to attend these sessions for members to become a member. And next week we will be discussing inclusion and the importance of inclusive play spaces so that all of our children can play outside. We will be listening to Kim Becheran from Touched by Olivia, who is based in New South Wales and is a wonderfully inspiring person who I'm sure everybody will benefit from listening to, but it is for our members. So please have a look at the membership pages on our website, and please take note of the invitations that we send you, because it clearly says what session is for members and what session is free. So thank you very much, everybody. That's it from us, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, Sue, again.
Okay. Thanks, Barbara.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.